everybody. I'm sitting down today with John Rhee of CODA Games. How you doing, John?
I'm doing good. Thanks.
Good. For those who don't know, what is Liege?
So Liege is a tactical RPG that we've been working on for the last 3 years. So it kind of takes a lot of inspiration from kind of these older games like Final Fantasy Tactics, older Fire Emblems, but also kind of blends in elements from JRPGs. So you kind of have, seamless exploration and story elements in the game, as well as elements from more modern tactical games. So definitely games like the new XCOM series and Transistor have definitely played a big influence on the mechanics side.
Man, yeah, I didn't even think about Transistor. Yeah, I can see a lot of similarities there.
Right.
Could you go a little bit more into the inspirations for Liege? What really drew you to trying to make a somewhat old school, but also somewhat new school tactics RPG?
Sure. So originally, I always kind of wanted to create kind of an old school RPG ever since I played games like FF6 and Chrono Trigger as a kid. So that was kind of the first thing that kind of got me into making games and into RPGs specifically. But then over time, as I kind of got older, I kind of became more interested in the strategy and the tactics side of things. So first time I played FF Tactics, that was kind of, it blew the doors wide open. And from there, I just kind of, branched out into other games kind of in the genre. So those were kind of like the main sort of inspirations on the game side. And really, Liege has kind of become kind of just a combination of all the different games that I really love coming up, kind of, blended into one. So you'll kind of see it tries to seamlessly kind of blend in a lot of different types of genres, both on kind of more of the JRPG side as well as the strategy side. Outside of games, there's probably too many influences to list. There's really a ton. But on the story side, definitely, stories like Game of Thrones and, even a lot of the fantasy novels that I read growing up are definitely kind of there in the story side. And I kind of wanted to try using the JRPG kind of format to tell those types of stories as opposed to kind of the lighter stuff that you normally see in JRPG types of games.
Yeah, it definitely was a lot more grounded when I got to try the demo at Too Many Games. That was everybody's in a panic and trying to get things together, and no one is running around in short shorts with a sword that's 10 feet long.
Right. I definitely think that it's something, and I'm surprised it kind of hasn't been done more before. But usually in these types of games, it definitely has a lot of what you're kind of describing, just like the very bright kind of cartoonish types of characters and settings. And I kind of wanted to try using the same format, but kind of in a much darker setting.
Interesting. And that really does speak to what makes Liege stick out, because despite several classical inspirations, you're going for a very different approach than most indie devs, especially in terms of the style. What led you to give the game such a painterly look?
So that's an interesting story. I guess like from the beginning, I always kind of wanted to do like a modern take on the classic 16-bit type of RPG. So originally, I was actually planning on doing something much simpler. So the game's kind of been through a few different art styles at this point. And recently, I guess kind of to go back towards the beginning, I'd been working on the game for a few years, just kind of part-time. And then I left my job to kind of pursue it full-time. We did a Kickstarter, and I was able to bring on an extra artist to help out. So he's really kind of done, the environments and really defined the look that we have now. But definitely, I always kind of imagined kind of creating a top-down game which really looked like kind of a moving painting. That was kind of the goal from the beginning.
Yes. What is it about isometric gaming that you think still intrigues people after all these years?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think part of it's really just kind of having grown up with the format. It's just kind of, I love those types of games since I was a kid. And I don't know, especially kind of when you look at kind of like the newer Final Fantasies, which really kind of, embraced 3D and kind of took it to these crazy places. I always kind of thought there was a lot more that could be done, just kind of with that traditional top-down format. And I kind of wanted to explore that, and it kind of fit into our situation as well, just because obviously we don't have the resources to make this huge blockbuster 3D game. So I guess what made more sense for us was to kind of go more for the stylized route, and to really kind of try to take that top-down format as far as we could.
You've also said previously that Liege is planned as a trilogy with an interconnecting story. So will player choices have any impact across the story, or are you going more for the traditional JRPG style of a rigid storyline, but nice little details that note when the player makes a choice?
Right. So for the most part, we do want there to be kind of a core main storyline, which we can really kind of craft, and really make it, a good, solid experience. From my experience, it seems like branching is kind of hard to do, right? And I think, and I mean, obviously, you want to give players agency, but at the same time, we need to be realistic about what we can accomplish as a basically one full-time and two part-time studio. So definitely, like, what we're trying to do is more have the main kind of storyline be traditional, and then to have kind of a handful of meaningful choices that you can make along the way, and that'll kind of be, I guess both sides of wherever the quest branches. We want them to be fully developed. So it's not going to be by any means like a Skyrim situation where you just are placed in the world. It's more like old school RPG with kind of a few key points in the story where you can make interesting decisions.
And kind of like the most recent Fire Emblem, they actually had where outright would split into two different games depending on which choice you made right after the end of the tutorial, as I understand it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting what they did there. I mean, that's like, depending on that choice, you basically get two different games. For us, I mean, I would love to kind of. I wish I had the resource to do something like that, but for me, I mean, I think from the beginning, I did have a very specific story that I wanted to tell in the game, and I think that for the most part, more of the interesting decisions that players are going to make is going to be on the mechanic side, as far as how they want to manage their units, how they want to manage their roster, and all that sort of thing, and then just to kind of have a few kind of well-crafted points in the story where you're actually made to make kind of interesting decisions, as opposed to just having everything kind of watered down, I guess, throughout, where you're kind of just making a lot of kind of fluff decisions just for the sake of giving players choices.
Yeah. And speaking of choices in combat, you're going with a very different approach from what a lot of RPGs, even today, are doing. Right. Basically the complete flip side of something like Disgaea, where they have like 9,000 levels. You're going for no emphasis on heavy grinding, but instead, no matter what, your units are vulnerable and you have to be very tactical about the combat.
Right.
How are you going to be handling encounters? Are you doing random encounters at all, or is it all scripted? And will players unlock more skills and tactical options since they can't buff their stats?
Right. So, I mean, there's definitely a lot of progression in the game as far as how you advance your units and how you customize them. But I wanted the game really to be much more about unlocking new abilities and tactical options, as opposed to just min-maxing stats and just really becoming invincible by the end game. Especially because kind of the game doesn't really treat, I guess, death lightly. It's really about, characters and their lives, and I didn't want death to kind of feel cheap, where you just, die and then you use the Phoenix down and you're alive again, and, we wanted death to be meaningful in the game.
So will there be permadeath?
There will. So there's kind of a main cast of a handful of characters, and if they die, since they're central to the story, it's game over and you kind of go back to the last save point. But then there is a secondary set of characters who do have permadeath. And
these are characters that participate in the narrative. And
right. So there's actually both. There's kind of we kind of group them into three categories. So the primary characters are the ones that need to survive every battle. Secondary characters, they have kind of side roles in the story. So if you keep them, you can kind of see how their stories pan out. But if you lose them for good. And then in some of the larger battles, you kind of get these. They're basically, you can think of them as like pawns in chess, where you have them for that one battle, and the idea is that in some cases you'll need to sacrifice them strategically to keep your more important characters alive, and that kind of ties into some of the themes that we have in the game as far as lords and um, that sort of thing. So I mean, definitely. I mean, it's not the type of game where you can just kind of tank your way through it. You'll definitely be losing units, and the idea is that you want to try to save as many of your guys as you can. And that's kind of one of the ways that we scale difficulty. So instead of just having an easy, medium, and hard setting, the idea is if you're playing the game well, you can keep as many of your guys alive by the end of the game as you can. But if you're not doing as well, you can still get through the game, but you just won't have as many people that you've saved.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very reminiscent of the recent XCOM games. And very intriguing. And speaking of what we were talking about earlier with how there's been a rush of new tactics and JRPGs, we've seen a lot of shifts in that. Like, as you said, Final Fantasy has gone not only full 3D, but they've also gone real-time combat, while we got things like I Am Setsuna, which is trying to go all the way back to Chrono Trigger styles of JRPGs and tactics. And we're even seeing an increase in Western approaches to the genre, like games such as Ubisoft's Child of Light. Where do you see the tactics and role-playing tactics genre head in the next few years? And is there anything you'd like to see change?
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. I mean, so we've been working on the game for, over 3 years now. And originally it was kind of going to be kind of an older school, one guy moves at a time, kind of traditional turn-based RPG. And as I kind of played games like the new XCOM reboot, games like Transistor, even Fire Emblem Awakening, one thing I did notice is that the genre as a whole seems to be getting much faster paced. So, like, if you play a game like FF Tactics now, and I love that game and I'll always love it, just the pacing of it feels much slower than even other turn-based games that you see coming out today. So, XCOM, for example, like, they did away with action points completely. And they just kind of did the 2-move system, and I think that's definitely kind of a trend that we had to kind of change our design, our initial design, to kind of try to, I guess, take heed of. So we wound up breaking a lot of stuff and start going back to the drawing board after we implemented the system in its entirety, which is part of why the game's been taking so long to make.
Well, that's understandable. That's a lot of core mechanics getting shifted.
Right. So, luckily, I think that it's much more interesting now than it was when, the first prototype was done. But, definitely anytime you try to break the mold and you try to innovate anywhere, even if it's in a small way, there's a million things that can go wrong. Things can get confusing, and you need to teach the players, and you need to make the UI work. And especially as a small team, doing that kind of iteration is very time-consuming. But so I guess getting back to your questions, I definitely think that's one trend. I would say another trend is, and this was kind of unexpected, I guess as graphics get better, turn-based games tend to work less, just because there's a certain weirdness, and you kind of run into like an uncanny valley problem where it's weird when you have like a fully rendered 3D character standing on a grid, waiting to get cut down, and he's doing nothing to defend himself. And it works if they're kind of like these cartoonish sprites, just because you understand in your head that it's a game. But, when you get like these awesome looking characters and it's very realistic, it just stops working in the same way. And I think that's part of the reason why even the Final Fantasy games now, they can't do, traditional turn-based mechanics in the same way, just because it just looks odd. Like it just, like, players will play it and it just doesn't feel right. And that's another issue that we ran into after we upgraded our art. The same mechanics that we had originally just stopped working because there was just this whole new level of weirdness of the character just standing stationary on a grid without moving. So we needed to kind of play around with both mechanics and the presentation to try to kind of bring that together in a way that actually worked.
Interesting. It's very interesting to hear. And actually reminds me of something I heard about with the XCOM games. Modders actually dug around in the code, and originally it was just like how you said about how the character not responding looking odd. At first, Firaxis actually had so the characters would automatically have like Overwatch, but it would have a lower chance of hitting. because
Right.
they knew that the players were going to be confused as to why isn't my guy shooting back.
Right. And I mean, that's actually another interesting thing that I only realized after I started implementing. The reason why it's less weird in XCOM is because the idea is that the units are always in cover. So it's not that weird if you have a unit crouched behind cover and not doing anything, but like in a melee situation where you have a bunch of swordsmen in a field, like
Oh, yeah.
it's a different situation because you expect them to kind of act and react, um, especially when the graphics are at a higher level and closer to reality.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I mean that was something that was honestly completely unexpected going into this project. And after 2 or 3 upgrades, and now that our characters are looking much better, we only realized how kind of odd it seemed and how it stopped working. Um, so it's funny how you kind of need to raise the bar, I guess, consistently in the different areas of the game design. You can't, if you move, the graphics, or if you change something in one part of the game, you need to kind of bring up the rest to kind of make it consistent.
Mhm.
And that's something I just never realized until I actually kind of was in the thick of it.
Very interesting. Speaking of being in the thick of it, from what I understand, Liege is built on a custom engine. You were actually showing off how you could change characters' faces and all of that. Why did you opt for a custom engine, which, as sole programmer, you're put behind making sure that all runs too on top of the game over
Uh,
something established like Unity or Unreal? Sorry.
so we're actually using Unity, but we're doing kind of a lot of custom tech on top of it.
Oh, okay.
So we're using one of the good things about Unity is that it exposes a lot of its editor functions and a lot of its APIs so that you can actually extend it beyond its out-of-the-box capabilities.
Mhm.
So I mean, the great thing about Unity is that it lets us do things like porting to various platforms without too much effort. And it has kind of built-in support for things like consoles and which we're planning on doing. But I mean, definitely, we've invested a ton of time in building a platform, especially just because we are a small team, and I mean, if you can even call it that at the moment. Um, I did want to invest as much time into making the production process as painless as possible. So, I mean, there's definitely a ton of tools that we've built, and that's especially true because RPGs in particular, I mean, just have a lot of moving part, and they're very content heavy. So certain types of games you can kind of just build the framework and it's fun, and you can just kind of keep, I guess, milking gameplay out of that. But I mean, RPGs are about you have to make every town and every house and every character. You have to craft all of those by hand, so it's very labor intensive. So there's been kind of a lot that we've invested to try to make that production requirement as painless as possible.
Indeed. As a designer and programmer, a lot of the game's development rests on your shoulders. How do you handle working on so many parts of the game, and what advice do you have for other aspiring game devs who want to work on the design and coding side, or might be looking at doing it as part of a 3-man team, or even a 2-man or 1-man team?
Don't do it. uh, so I mean, it's kind of a funny situation for me because um, I've kind of been trapped in this vicious cycle of the game just continually getting bigger, in part because of kind of what we talked about before, where once you commit to kind of improve one part of the game, um, you kind of obligate yourself to bring the rest of it up to make it consistent.
Yeah.
And we've kind of been stuck in that cycle for the last 3 years now. So thankfully, our Kickstarter supporters have been super understanding, and they've been very patient, and they're kind of the mentality as a whole seems to be to just take all the time that we need to really just make the game as good as it possibly could be, as opposed to just rushing it out the door.
Yeah.
And for that, I mean, we're super thankful. I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of other campaigns which haven't had that same kind of response.
Yeah.
And I think, in fairness, I think part of it's because we do try to be as transparent about our process and our progress as possible. But by no means, I don't think that any creator on Kickstarter should expect that from their audience. So, but yeah, I mean, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. I mean, getting back
Well,
to,
that's fine.
getting back to creating. I mean, I would definitely say, if possible, start small, because any idea you have is always going to grow. Just kind of as inspiration hits you, and as the genres evolve, and as kind of you find the fun in the game, I mean, you need to kind of give yourself the bandwidth to explore that. I mean, just go in with the understanding that it's more work than you think. I mean, I come from, a project management background, so I think of myself as someone that's pretty disciplined about, structuring my time and my resources. But, I mean, at least
kind of catches you by surprise.
Yeah, I mean, Liege has been kind of a spectacular time management failure by pretty much any metric. But I mean, I think that's another thing. I mean, just coming from like a normal non-game development background, games in particular are very specific in that it's very, very difficult to estimate how much time it's going to get from the start to the finish. I mean, normally if you're just building like an application or a product or any other type of software, you're really just kind of building something to a spec where it just needs to perform a function. But with games, it's different because you need to kind of build something and then put it in front of people, gauge the response. And especially for a more complex game, there's also the teaching element, which you need to consider. So just getting something that, like a strategy game, getting a strategy game that people actually understand, let alone enjoy, with that being completely hand-fisted about how you tutorialize things, it is really tough and time-consuming. So just, I mean... don't think it's easy, because especially like with the recent rush of people making mobile games and the tools getting really, really good and really cheap. There's a ton of people that just hop onto Unity and other engines. I mean, Unreal is basically free now to start. But I mean, if you want to make anything interesting, it's definitely going to take a lot of time to just go in with that expectation, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well said. All right, we've got a little time left, so if you'd like to ask me and or my audience a question, please feel free.
I mean, I don't really have anything too specific, but I mean, if there's anything that you guys find about the game that's not clear as far as how we're pitching it or how we're explaining it, or if there's anything that you want to learn about the game, I mean, definitely, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I love talking to our fans, and I'm more than happy to kind of, answer any questions or really kind of hear what you guys kind of think about our progress so far and, things that you'd like to see. So if there's anything like that, I mean, definitely don't be shy about reaching out.
All right. And feel free to leave some of your feedback in the comments below. And you can also find John on Twitter and also include a website to CODA Games' website. So you can check in on blog updates on how Liege is proceeding. Thank you so much for sitting down with me, John. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Sometimes a Sith Lord is the right person for the job. Star Wars Month continues with explosions and ridiculous boss battles in LucasArts' final major in-house game. This is The Force Unleashed.
I'm waking up to ash and dust. I wipe my brow and I sweat my rust. I'm breathing in the chemicals.
For those who don't know, what is Fathom?
Oh, am I to answer that one? Well, I'll start. It's a action RTS that's set underwater. That's kind of the one-liner. But there's a lot going on in the game. I would say if, you're into Descent, that's kind of one of our inspirations. So it's got that kind of 6 degrees of freedom motion and tries to tie in some RTS elements, with like base building and unit building and even a little bit of unit commanding. So, it's just meant to be kind of a hybrid. We tried to boil it down, so it was...
This is Epistory, Typing Chronicles.